you through a little bit of time travel with Jakkie as we launch his book on Fate of the Nation, which looks at 3 future scenarios for South Africa. We'll take you from where we are today, going a little bit into the history of South Africa, more the political and economic history of South Africa over the past 24 years. And then Jakkie, who's a much better Doctor Who than I ever could be, will take us into the future and really look into his crystal ball in terms of what he sees as the future for South Africa. I'm Otilia Anamanganidze. I head special projects here at the ISS, and I will be your chair for this session, and I will also moderate the discussion. The first part of the session is open to the public, so I also welcome our online audience. And then after that, we will have a closed discussion, which will be under Chatham House rule. This event, as I pointed out, is the launch of this book, which all of you don't have yet, but I hope you will have after the end of the seminar, that I've had a chance to read over the past month or so, Jakkie, for my sins.
Punishment.
But less so, actually, because as we spoke about in the morning earlier, less for my sins and more because the more I read through it, and I did say to you, it felt like a journey back in South Africa to South Africa today. And then me trying to think, could this really be the future of South Africa? But because you'll never make it easy for us, Jakkie, you gave us 3 scenarios, not 1. You gave us options. You gave us roads to look into. The first thing I did when I got this book about a month ago was I opened to the last chapter. It's a bad habit. So we're going to start where you begin your end. And I'm going to read this line to everyone here in the audience and all of the people who are listening in. South Africa in 2017 is an infinitely better place than it was in 1990, when negotiations for the future started between the National Party and the ANC and others. I'll stop there, not least because the next sentence ends with wasted. This chapter is titled Towards Meaningful Radical Economic Transformation. I think radical economic transformation is something that many of you have heard over the past month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe a little bit more. Some of you, at least those of you who may follow the South African Communist Party, none of you was born in 1927, but some of you would have heard that language going beyond the past couple of months. So Jakkie, let's start here. Tell me, where are we right now?
Well, South Africa in 2017 is in a bad spot, but we're in a significantly better position than we were by any comparison, by any stretch of the imagination in 1994. F.W. de Klerk and the National Party bequeathed to the ANC a country that was essentially bankrupt. Coffers were bare, there was no handover. De Klerk and his cronies walked out. Mandela and his team walked in. There was no handover. There was no economic policy. There was no trust of the officials that were running South Africa. So the ANC came in at a low point and objectively have done remarkably well. Yes, and you stop before reading that sentence, the last 10 years were essentially a wasted decade. And it will take us another decade, possibly less, to recover from what we consider to be the wasted decade of the Zuma administration. I think there's little doubt about that. But the prospects are positive. South Africa, since the end of the Second World War, has had an average growth rate of 3.4%. And our best case forecast, which we call Mandela Magic, looks out to 2034 and also thinks that we can get back to that average. That average is not what we need. We need a minimum, an absolute minimum of 5% growth in South Africa if we are going to deal with what I consider to be the number 1 challenge in South Africa, which is unemployment. You cannot fix inequality. You cannot fix poverty without fixing employment. We have to give people jobs. And that is what I mean by radical economic transformation. And that is placing job creation at the center of everything we do. So every decision that is made should be judged by one criteria, that is creating jobs. Nothing can resolve South Africa's problems. Not black economic empowerment, not the South African Communist Party. It is only jobs. So I think for me it was quite a revelation working through and looking at how South Africa has gotten to where we are, the main challenges. We're sitting at an unemployment rate of 28% in South Africa. It is not sustainable. The only thing that can change that going forward is jobs. Because jobs, you tie people into the formal economy, they become part of the formal system. Growing the informal economy is important for South Africa as well, but only growing the formal economy can really save South Africa, can help South Africa move. I think that's the other issue, maybe also to underline, that is that South Africa will, under all the scenarios in this book, grow. It will not grow rapidly enough. I think the minimum growth forecast is about 1.3% average to 2034, which is our low road scenario, which we call a nation divided. But let me stop there.
You've spoken about jobs. I've heard campaign slogans about jobs. I don't think you're campaigning for anything, at least not just to sell your book. That's one of 4 challenges that you highlight in your book, Jakkie. And you don't speak about the issue of employment or jobs first. Can you take us through what you say are the 4 greatest challenges that South Africa is facing now, in addition to employment or unemployment?
The government tells us repeatedly that South Africa faces three big challenges: inequality, poverty, and employment, or lack of jobs. I say there are 4, because the 4th one, the elephant in the room, is governance. Because poor governance and incoherent governments and I want to put it quite strongly, the incompetence of the Zuma administration is why we are where we are. South Africa need not have been downgraded had it not been for the cabinet reshuffle that we had in March of this year. Our economy was starting to take off. All the prospects, green shoots as the economists call them, were starting to show. And then we have a late night cabinet reshuffle. A disastrous, there is no other way to describe the impact that poor governance, state-owned enterprises, etc., has had on South Africa. So those are the 4 challenges that are outlined in a specific chapter on the book. We all know how deep poverty is in South Africa, and we know the extent to which social grants have made a huge contribution to helping alleviate extreme poverty. But without jobs, that is a short-term and eventually an unsustainable strategy over long time horizons. So, social grants, very important, help to alleviate poverty. It has also helped to alleviate inequality at the lower end of the distribution curve in South Africa. But it can only do that at the lower end of the distribution curve. When you talk to economists and people that speak in figures, they point to what they refer to as a distributional cliff in South Africa between low-end people that are propped up by social grants and then people at the other end of the spectrum that, in actual fact, earn relatively well. For example, and employment creation at that end has largely been a function of the expansion of government and government employees. But in between, you have this cliff. And so we can speak about inequality, we can speak about poverty, but the only thing that can deal with that is the 3rd issue, which is employment creation. And what is standing in the way of employment creation is poor governance. We've now got the 14-point economic plan, which was before that we had the 9-point plan. Before that, and we can go back until the RDP. And after the RDP came GEAR, and there's quite a long stretch in the book that deals with the transition from the Reconstruction and Development Program. I should have used that for foreigners that are not into the South African acronym soup. when the Reconstruction and Development Program was the ANC's election plank, largely driven and determined by COSATU through the Tripartite Alliance. And South Africa did not grow. And then basically when Thabo Mbeki took over, the RDP was replaced by what is generally considered a macroeconomic friendly program, South Africa's own structural adjustment program called GEAR. And during the period of GEAR, South Africa grew. This was Thabo Mbeki, Trevor Manuel. Unemployment came down. The economy saw the most rapid growth rate since the 1960s, 1970s. But all of that, we were doing well. But then came the global financial crisis. And it is at the global financial crisis, and this is important to recognize in defense of President Zuma, he came to power at the time of a global financial recession. And he took over, he looked at the options, he tried to bind South Africa, to hook our sails to the BRIC countries, because that's where growth was happening, to the east, not in the west. The west was in
Brazil,
recession.
Russia, India, and China.
That is correct. And that, in a sense, is, I think people tend to underestimate the effort that Zuma made and his advisors made to find a new growth pole for South Africa. And that was really the BRIC economies. We became a member, it became BRICS. But because of the competition from China, it in actual fact didn't work out exactly as we had it. But in subsequent years, the incoherence, the incompetence, and the poor governance of the Zuma administration has cost South Africa hundreds of billions of rand in terms of growth.
I'm still stuck on jobs. Tell me a little bit more about what these jobs are. Are we talking about the jobs you and I have? What are these jobs that will ultimately pull South Africa out of where it is at the moment?
In the final chapter of the book, I quote extensively, that we have a number of presidential and other panels that have tried to provide South Africa with advice. But we have also in South Africa an amazing academic and analytical capacity. And in the final chapter, I quote from one recent book that has come out by the head of the business school in Cape Town, which speaks really of the importance of how jobs can be created. And he makes the point that what South Africa needs, which we all know, are low-end growing our manufacturing capacity, because the manufacturing capacity lies at the heart of any growing economy. And there are people that think you can jump to a services economy and skip the manufacturing economy. I don't think that is possible. I think that is foolhardy. There is no country in the world that has done that. People quote Singapore, which has got one of the highest manufacturing sectors in the world. So those jobs, and let me just read a passage from you from that. The book is by UCT economist Anthony Black, and it's called Towards Employment Intensive Growth in South Africa. And he, for example, lists a number of sectors in South Africa that he believes can provide that kind of growth, employment-intensive growth. So he writes, with massive growth in employment and the low end, so Anthony Black says, the economy has to walk on two legs. With massive growth in employment at the low end, accompanied by increased dynamism in the advanced sector, more rapid growth in the labor-intensive sectors will create new sources of demand, upgrade skills, and produce new small firms. All of this will galvanize the advanced sector. And so he carries on by making this argument of walking on two legs. We need to grow both what we refer to as our advanced or our knowledge-based economy, and we need to grow employment firstly in our manufacturing sector, which government is trying to do. But it's struggling against itself, would be the argument.
I'm going to take us away from jobs for a moment, and I'll go to chapter 3, where you talk about elections. Now, chapter 3 is titled, What Do the Recent Elections Tell Us? The recent elections, obviously, being the local government elections, but also the last general election in 2014. Now, not to say I wasn't a believer of international futures by any measure, but I read this book before last night, believe it or not. I read this book before last night, and in there you detail what South Africa's population will be in 2019, using the model and using some of the data from the UN Population Division to do that. But what made me a believer only last night was because yesterday Stats SA came out with what the population is currently. In here you tell us that the population in 2019 will be at 57 million. I think Stats SA agrees with you. They haven't read this book yet. Now, this alone, and when we begin this conversation around voters and what voters will do, and I'm reminded of a paper you wrote a couple of years ago around the future in terms of voting, and particularly where for you, and you spoke then around if there would be a turning point, it would unlikely be 2019, but it would be 2024.
Yeah.
As a recent believer, I'm going to ask you, tell us a little bit more about the future of voting. And perhaps before I go into that, and I think the one line that stuck out for me was this, what you regard as the expanding cohort of born-free voters, but also coupled with that, the growing urbanization and something that you didn't mention in respect of the challenges, which is the improvements in level of education. Yeah. How will that change the way in which people, not just the ones in this room, but people who will be eligible to vote in 2024 or 2019, by the way, what will change?
So what we did, Cilliers, thanks. What we did is we did a forecast that looked at South Africa's population out to 2034. And we compared that, our forecast, with, for example, the forecast that was done for the National Development Plan. Our forecast of South Africa's population by 2034 is significantly higher. It's in actual fact what the National Development Plan referred to as the migration shock scenario. There are many reasons for this, but we use a model, the International Futures Forecasting System, to model the future of South Africa. It is a massive integrated assessment model that we've used for many of our papers. As a basis to see where we are headed, we first get the population right. And amongst that, we then calculated and forecast the size of the what we refer to as the born-free voters. And we size them and we ask, what is the impact of those voters going to be for every election? Now, South Africa's next election is 2019, 2024, 2029, and 2034. This book stops just ahead of forecasting results for the 2034 elections. But we give election forecasts on 3 scenarios for the 3 major parties, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, for each of these scenarios. So we are saying that under these circumstances, these are the outcomes that we expect in 2019. Under a most likely scenario, which we refer to as the Bafana scenario, which is after South Africa's below-performing national soccer team, sort of dribbling along, passing the ball, there's no captain, no real team spirit, and so on. So that's sort of our Bafana scenario. Under that scenario, we believe that the ANC will get about 53% of... First, let me make the point that we believe that that scenario sort of plays out that what happens in December of 2017 at the ANC's national conference is that the ANC is divided between 2 large factions. The reformers, largely headed by Cyril Ramaphosa, and the traditionalists, largely headed by Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. But eventually, what happens in December, the party is so divided that an agreement is made that a combined reformer traditionalist alliance will take South Africa forward. That keeps South Africa, we're doing better, but we muddle along. So something like Ramaphosa as president, Dlamini Zuma as deputy president, something along that line. And under that kind of muddling along scenario, South Africa, the ANC gets about 53%, the DA 28%, I think, and the EFF goes to 11%. I may have that wrong. And then we forecast this out. By 2024, the ANC dips below 50%. It needs an alliance. The only alliance partner that is available for the ANC is the EFF. And the ANC, along the lines that we see at the moment, becomes increasingly populist. Populism is great. It makes us all feel fantastic, particularly if you're young, which excludes me, but not you. But it, unfortunately, does not provide a solution to many of the challenges that face South Africa. And unfortunately, part of the premise of the book is that government, in a sense, has run out of options. It needs a partnership with the private sector if it is to grow the economy. But that doesn't really happen under the Bafana scenario. Mm-hmm. So under the various other scenarios, and we can speak about that, different election forecasts happen. But under the Bafana most likely forecast, the ANC loses its election in 2024. Probably needs the EFF to stay to power. The ANC becomes increasingly a populist party. But in the process, you eat up your seed corn, is the old expression. You can't plant anymore because there's nothing left to plant. And South Africa, the eventual greatest beneficiary out of this, but that is only by 2029, is probably the DA. That's the one scenario, the most likely scenario that we think how that probably will play out.
Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? Asked Alice. That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then, said the cat, it doesn't matter which way you go. This is how you open this chapter on the three scenarios, essentially looking at the immediate future of South Africa and beyond. Why?
We don't have direction. Well, the ANC does not have direction. One of the central premises underlying the book is that the ANC remains central to the future of South Africa. It is most likely going to still get a majority. I am not a believer that the ANC will dip below 50% unless the ANC splits. And in my view, the ANC will split in 2018, next year, if the traditionalists have a clean sweep at the December conference at the end of this year. Why will the ANC split? Because if the traditionalists take over, Gauteng ANC have got nowhere to go. They split off, they form an own party, and that party together with the DA probably can govern Gauteng. Once the ANC have lost Gauteng, it has already lost the Western Cape. It's the economic heartland of South Africa. The future for the ANC is fairly clear, written again on the wall, and it's not a nice future in terms of electoral support. So ANC is central. And what happens in the ANC is going to determine what happens to all of us in South Africa. So if we find a party that is not prepared to really drag the ANC from a freedom charter mindset into a future, which is a future of innovation and of growth, partnership with the private sector, not a capital-intensive economy, but a labor-intensive economy, which is a slightly different growth path to where we are headed at the moment. Because at the moment, decisions are all capital-intensive. And the best example of that would be going for the nuclear deal. It would be a disastrous decision for the South African economy. We can maybe I'll stop there because I'm going off on all kinds of tangents here.
Well, a nation of tangents. You've spoken about these two, the reformers and the traditionalists, which you have in chapter 4, and you tabulated quite well in terms of what is a traditionalist and what is a reformer. Something else happened last night. Someone else threw their hat into the ring, as it were. Mzwandile Masina said he too will be running for president. So while we're talking of the African National Congress, so while we're talking about sort of this binary in terms of the traditionalists, the reformers, and you've mentioned now the Gauteng ANC, why all these new actors? And they're not new, but now everyone is throwing their hat into the ring, everyone wants to be president. Or do they really? What are your thoughts?
It's a pity that Bantu Olomisa couldn't make it this morning. He would have been able to respond much more effectively, I think, to the ongoing political shenanigans. But I think it's all smoke and mirrors. I think largely it's about putting the various slates together. The Ramaphosa slate, who's going to be his deputy? He's already said he needs a woman, and that's probably Lindiwe Sisulu. The Dlamini Zuma slate, which is less clear, who's going to be on her slate. And I think that the various contenders that are all coming out of the woodwork are all part of political smoke and mirrors to weaken the one faction and to put your money, probably in real terms, or the Gupta's monies or whomever, behind somebody else. So I think that there eventually is, in my view, really two serious contenders. And I think the others are there, but I don't think that they are really serious contenders. I think they've not been campaigning and working at this for the last 3-4 years.
Mm-hmm. A week from now, exactly to the date, on the 8th of August this year, there will be the 8th motion for a vote of no confidence into the president. What you've said so far tells me, or at least suggests to me, that you don't think that vote will succeed.
No, I don't think so.
Why?
I think that what will happen is that Baleka, the speaker, is in a difficult spot. Now, I do not follow the intricacies of the politics that closely, but I'd be very surprised if that vote proceeds. If she decides at number 99 that this is going to be going to be secret, then probably the EFF and the DA will have already indicated that they're going to take this to court. And this issue will be, so there will be no, I don't think there will be a vote on the 8th. I think that President Zuma, there are a few ANC members of parliament who have indicated and probably will vote for the opposition no matter what, if it's open or secret. But I think President Zuma will hang in there till December. And he is a major liability for the ANC. I mean, in reality, neither the DA or the EFF really want him to stand back, because the longer he is in there, the better the ANC, they will do. If he stays on, now I believe that his history come December. In January, February, first quarter of next year, President Zuma will somehow step down. If he stays on until 2019, I think that's the only scenario under which the ANC will, under that scenario, the ANC will dip below 50%. He has become a huge liability for the party. So in my view, the vote of no confidence probably not happen. The can will be kicked down the road. Zuma will still be with us in December. But come the first quarter of next year, the new leader of the ANC, whomever that is, will take over. And that person, whomever he or she is, will lead the ANC into the 2019 elections. And it is for that reason that I don't believe that the ANC will, under that scenario, go under 50%. Because the ANC will have a year and a half, 2 years, under new leadership, to remanage the deck chairs, not on the Titanic, but reorganize a few things on some ship. And the ANC, under any management, will do better than under Jacob Zuma.
There is something they say about cats and the number of lives that they have. 8 votes, probably not quite there at 9 yet. But I've given you an opportunity to take us through different aspects of your book. There's some that we haven't touched on, and I thought in the last 5 minutes of this conversation that you and I are having before we open the conversation to other people in the room, I'm going to give the titles of the chapters that I haven't spoken about. And I'm going to ask you, we didn't talk about this before, so I'm sorry. I'm going to ask you to give me, in a sentence, 2 sentences, your thoughts on that thing. Zuma and the future of the ANC, 2 sentences.
A big liability for the ANC, who will survive until early next year, and power is seeping away from him every day as we speak.
Chapter 2, the Republic of No Consequences. What are those?
That is really a summary of the impact of poor management that we've seen. A summary of the Gupta saga, the extent of mismanagement of the state-owned enterprises, mismanagement of grants, and so on. So, yeah.
We've covered chapter 3 and 4. If you would like to know what those are, get yourself a copy. So we'll go to chapter 5, economic and human development impacts on the scenarios.
Yeah, what we do there is we take the International Futures Forecasting System and we model the impact of every scenario. Growth rates, size of the economy, average income levels, carbon emissions, and we look at what is the most likely associated characteristics of the South African economy under each of these 3 scenarios.
We skipped chapter 6 because we dealt with the challenges. Why is our economy not growing, you ask us in chapter 7?
The essence of chapter 7 is really about the management of the economy. We've touched upon that, but it is a lack of predictability for investment decisions on the economy.
Chapter 8, my favorite, crime, violence, and instability. You can give me more than 2 sentences because it's my favorite.
Again, we take the 3 scenarios and we first look at where South Africa finds itself in terms of crime trends. Now, we are in a much better position than we were even by, I think, 2000. But since then, in the last 5-6 years, we've seen an increase in the murder rate, for example, of 22%. Now, the murder rate is the best proxy for general rates and incidences of crime. But things have gotten things have gotten worse the last few years. Also in terms of violence around elections, and we speculate upon what is the potential outcomes if the ANC is challenged. Really, there is a chance that the ANC could lose an election, because that would bring South Africa to a difficult point. We believe that we already see a significant amount of intimidation, assassinations, particularly in KZN, but we believe that the South African system will hold. But there's a whole chapter that deals with crime, violence, and so on.
South African comparative context.
Yes, there we look at the impact of the scenarios on South Africa's international standing. We look at where South Africa, where we are at the moment in terms of international relations, and then look at our relative influence in Africa under these 3 scenarios. And the impact is quite different. So we do, actual fact, a global growth forecast looking at the shifting balance of power and influence between the BRICS and the EU and the G7 nations, and where South Africa finds itself within that context, as well as within the African context, where we steadily lose ground, except under the Mandela Magic scenario, where we retain our diplomatic influence, and South Africa at the moment is arguably the most influential country in Africa.
Thank you, Jakkie. I'm all talked out, and for those of you who might not be able to tell, this is not my usual voice. Pretty much all talked out on my side, but I think the people in the room likely have a number of questions for you. But before we cut the live feed and before we go into Chatham House discussion, some questions that you might have, to those who are in the room and those who aren't, this book will be launched again tomorrow night at Exclusive Books here at Brooklyn Mall from 6:30. So please be there if for no other reason other than that you'll get to know a little bit more about the content in the book, but there'll also be wine and cheese.
And Samadoda Fikeni is going to be the respondent
yes,
tomorrow
and
evening.
Samadoda Fikeni will be the respondent for tomorrow evening. And at the same time, I thought before we do break, a lot of what you've heard so far from Jakkie, and you'll hear a little bit more in the second half, but a lot of what you've heard so far from Jakkie is really what this book is a product of a lot of building blocks. This book did not sort of just happen in many ways, but over the past 4 years, through the African Futures Initiative, but also through the work that Jakkie and his team have been doing on forecasting, not just South Africa's future, but the future of the continent as well, it has involved looking at a range of things. The peace and stability aspect, which the ISS is known for, but also delving into areas of work that perhaps we're not traditionally known for, which are the issues around the economy, but also a number of issues related to development. A lot of that would not be possible without the funding that we've received from the Hans Seidel Foundation to do that work. And so it is, I think, worth acknowledging their presence in the room, and also particularly the role that they've played in building our work on African futures and forecasting. With that note, I will now bid farewell to our online audience. Thank you for your attention. No, thank you for not coming. We'll now go into a closed discussion with the people that are here in the room. So for those who are here in the room, we are now going into Chatham House rule, which means you can ask whatever question you want to. Anyone else in the room, including yourself, will not be able to cite the person who posed the question, nor the response you got from Jakkie, unless you receive express permission from that person. So if I don't see some of you going to that person after the meeting to ask, then the presumption is you did not get that permission. Do not quote the person after that. With that, I'm pretty much done.